Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I rise to support the bill before the House today, a bill put forward by the member for Whitlam, who has worked tirelessly to inform the public by attending forums across the country about scams. He's gone from town to town, from shopping centre to shopping centre, to make sure that Australians understand how intense the attacks on Australian consumers have become by scammers, by people who want to illegally take funds from Australians. And like many others, in preparation to speak on this bill, we're flabbergasted by the amounts that we're seeing. 1 in 25, I heard the previous speaker say, in terms of Australians being scammed. Sounds like a high number. My litmus test for these things is often reverted back to a visit to classrooms. So often I'm in a classroom talking about civics and citizenship, and it's astounding the number of primary school children who have questions about which levels of government are responsible to protect Australians from scams, and astounding the number of children who know stories about their parents having been scammed. I want to first of all make sure that those listening understand that it is the case that no one is exempt from being targeted by these scammers. Absolutely no one. I received a text message this week, supposedly from one of my sons, to say that their phone had been dropped in the sink and that they could be contacted on this number, obviously wanting me to ring this number and setting up that connect with the phone that I had in my hand. The constant attack, from my personal experience, I've also been and had amounts of money taken from my personal accounts repeatedly using systems where, and my advice to people is to keep an eye on those accounts. On the one hand, electronic transfer of funds makes us vulnerable to this. On the other hand, having your phone in your hand and your capacity to check what's going on in your bank accounts often is also a handy way to ensure that you're on top of these things if somebody has access to your account details and therefore making withdrawals or putting costs against them. I have been victim to that as well. And I want to share with the House, just this week I received an email from a constituent who is telling a story that I've heard from many business people in my community. Often when businesses are purchasing something large or perhaps purchasing another business, those conveyancing processes or the transfer of funds processes, you're hearing from business that they've been hacked in that process. Well, I received an email this week from a constituent who has lost the deposit on their house. The old story now, a well-known story, where the conveyancing company has been hacked, and the constituents received an email to say transfer the funds now to this bank account, and in faith has done that, only to find that there's been a hack at the other end. So the conveyancing company's emails have been hacked, and they've secured $90,000 from a constituent of mine, and that constituent is now in the processes that were outlined by the previous speaker of trying to recover those funds. And it is an enormous thing to think that you've saved so hard for a deposit for a house and that you can lose it in a blink of an eye, and then be found yourself with nowhere to go, and a very circuitous way where you are both the victim and now the person who has to try and recover those funds through various places. So it's great to see that this piece of legislation will give consumers more access to a single front door where they can report the loss and be supported in the process of trying to recover those funds. I think that's really important. I think the framework's really important. I think it sends a really strong message. to those involved, to the banks, to the telcos, to the social media businesses, where often those three things are involved in the scam processes that people are using. We know, and we've heard time and time again, that this is being set up by organised crime, and it requires a government response. I'm pleased to be here today to support this government's response, the Albanese Labor government's response at this stage, which will be to set up a framework where those businesses that are being used in these processes will be asked to meet standards and face civil penalties of up to $50 million for breaches where they have not been up to scratch in following the scams prevention framework. So this incentivises these businesses, whether they be banks, telcos or social media companies, to make sure that they are up to speed and have the protections in place that Australian consumers would expect them to have, and certainly government want them to have. Staying on top of the ever-evolving tricks and processes being used by these criminal gangs in targeting Australians is something that we want to encourage all businesses to do, and this framework is designed to do exactly that. Furthermore, what I'd say is that once this legislation is in place, I think we send a strong message to those criminal organisations that Australia will no longer be defenceless in its fight against scams, that Australian businesses will be working together and working with government so that the scammers leave our shores or find it more difficult to scam consumers in this country, and therefore turn their minds to perhaps making a living doing something legitimate. That would be the hope. Deputy Speaker, I don't think there's a family that I know that haven't been touched in some way, whether that be $500 that they've transferred thinking that they'd had an emergency call from a child and transferred funds to support a child in need because their wallet had been stolen or whatever the scammers' messages were. I don't think there's a family that I know that hasn't been touched by scams. So I know that across the country there will be people who will appreciate the work that has been done by the Minister in bringing forward this piece of legislation, and not just by the Minister but by government and by the banking sector and the telcos and all of those who've given information, who have sought to help find a way forward in this space to protect Australian consumers. I would add that I don't believe that this will be the final time that we're in the federal parliament talking about this or introducing legislation to protect consumers as this evolves further, but I do want to congratulate the Minister and those who've been involved in the consultation processes and in the design of this piece of legislation that will establish a scams prevention framework and penalties for those businesses who don't keep up in this war against criminal organisations wanting to steal from Australian consumers. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.